Hello. I am Albert Galaberta. I'm a professor of neurology at the medical school, and together with Alfonso Caramazza here, professor of psychology at FAS, we welcome you to this distinguished lecture series put up by MBB. We're pleased to see you here to witness, I'm sure, two fascinating talks by Ernst Fehr, who will be here today and tomorrow at the same time in the same place. As many of you know, MBB is a Harvard University-wide interfaculty initiative. The main concern of which is to get together minds from different disciplines to think about issues of mind and behavior from the biological point of view, and hopefully including as well the social sciences and the humanities to solve our biggest problems today. In keeping with this kind of mission, we have this distinguished lecture series where we invite people from around the world who have made substantial contributions in interdisciplinary research to come and share their knowledge with us. In this series, we've had people like Antonio Damasio, Noam Chomsky, Martha McClintock, Uda Frith, and many others in the past as many as 10 years. I'm sure today's is not going to be a disappointment. We have invited Ernst to come to talk to us, and without further ado, I present to you Professor David Leibson from the Department of Economics, who will make the introductions.
What an honor and privilege for me to introduce Ernst Fehr to you. Let me begin with the details. Ernst is a chair at the University of Zurich and has been chairman of the Department of Economics at Zurich for 15 years. I thought I knew Ernst very well. I didn't realize his service there had gone on for that long. That service is particularly remarkable because in addition to the intellectual contributions, which are monumental, Ernst is also an institution builder and has transformed the University of Zurich's economics department and many related fields at the University of Zurich during these last 15 years, making the university one of the greatest institutions in the world and training a generation of students that now dominate the field of economics across Europe and increasingly in the US. So he's an incredible citizen in the world of economics and an incredibly important institution builder, one to whom we're all very grateful. But that's the least of his achievements. Ernst has transformed economics twice over. And when I say transformed, I mean moved the entire field, completely changed the way economists and increasingly all social scientists think about the world. When Ernst began to work in experimental economics and in social preferences 2 decades ago, economists had very little tolerance for the notion that one person might care about another who didn't happen to be their relative. And Ernst's work, elegant experiments, beautiful designs, papers published one after another in our leading journals, have absolutely moved the entire profession. And now, when non-economists critique us for not caring about social preferences, I say, well, you haven't read the literature in 20 years. Ernst has transformed the entire field so that any economist today takes for granted that social preferences matter, a revolution to which we are indebted to Ernst. In addition, a second revolution is that he's brought biology into the field of economics, and I think we're going to hear about that tonight as well. Again, 20 years ago, there was no biological interest in our field, and Ernst has been one of the very critical figures in drawing our attention to the biological foundations of human behavior, of economic behavior, and integrating both the analysis of social preferences and the biology that underlies those preferences. A second revolution. So Ernst is a monumental figure in my field, and I am deeply honored to introduce him today, and excited to see what new research we're going to hear about. So let me introduce to you Ernst Fehr.
Well, so I'm not sure I can live up to the expectations that David raised right now, but let's try. So my talk is on the neurobiological foundations of human altruism, and I'd like to start to point out that we humans are an amazingly cooperative species. Actually, right now, what we experience right now is an act of cooperation. People come together, they want to hear somebody talk, they listen. It's a great act of cooperation that's right now taking place. And it's an act of cooperation among non-kin and strangers. Many in this room are not genetically related to each other. And I think almost no other species engages to the same extent in transmitting knowledge, transmitting cultural values and social norms. We have schools, enterprises, states. These are all examples of successful cooperation. And I'd like to make the claim, although I know that some economists might want to quarrel with me about this, that a lot of what we see, a lot of the cooperative infrastructure we see in the world has to do with, or has one component of it is human altruism. So it wouldn't exist without the human altruistic tendencies, without humans that engaged in behaviors that created these institutions and created the great amount of cooperation we see on Earth. And all this is related to the willingness to incur cost to help others or to help society, even if no future benefits are associated with it. So it's not the kind of behavior that comes through social exchange and economic exchange where we do things because we have mutual benefits, because some of the things we do even when we don't expect and don't get future and present benefits. Now, having said this, it's not surprising that there is a great literature on the evolutionary foundations of human altruism. So it started it started actually earlier, but the famous papers and the big breakthroughs were associated with names like Hamilton, who introduced kin selection into the fields of biology, reciprocal altruism introduced by Trivers, Axelrod, and Hamilton, reputation-based approaches like the ones by Novak and Sigmund, or group selection approaches like the ones by, let's say, Boyd and Richardson, Bowles and Ginty. So there's a lively debate in evolutionary circles about the evolutionary ultimate foundations of human altruism. However, there's a relatively small literature on the proximate biological mechanisms. So we know, in fact, not very much about the proximate biological mechanisms that are underlying human altruism. We know a lot about the patterns, the behavioral patterns, through social preference research in psychology, economics, and so on. But we know very little about the proximate biological mechanisms that underlie human altruism. And that's the topic of my talk today. And so let me tell you what I'm going to do today. I will basically present two papers, one published, one unpublished. And I will first talk a little bit about how we measure altruism, how we model it. Then I will talk about the role of theory of mind in altruism. So it will turn out that I believe that theory of mind may play an important role, and in particular about one brain area that has been reliably involved in theory of mind operations. And that brain area, I will show you a picture in a minute, is called the temporoparietal junction. It's a brain area above and behind your ears at the junction between the parietal cortex and the temporal cortex. And we will see that that brain area plays absolutely a key role for human ability to behave altruistically. I will go on to show you that gray matter volume in that area is related to human altruism. I will present you data that indicate that functional brain activation plays a key role in altruistic decision-making in that area. And finally, I will investigate, which is my favorite topic because it's about causality, about the causal role of that brain area. So what we will do is we will basically exogenously downregulate that area with non-invasive brain stimulation tools and see what it does and how it does it to altruistic decision making. Now, having told you what I'm going to do, let me show you this brain area. This is the temporoparietal junction on the right side of the cortex, and this is the topic of my interest today. And now let me come to measuring altruism. So how do we measure altruism? Well, we measure it by how much an individual is willing to give up to increase the payoff of another individual. And we do this, for example, with games like this. So individuals in this experiment, they face a lot of choices, and some of these choices look like this. The individual can go for 730 for him or herself, or for more. But if this is the selfish choice, if the individual makes this choice, then the other player, person B, gets less. So I can sacrifice money for the sake of somebody else's money. And that's the way we measure it. And so they face lots of such trials. And now, how do we model that formally? It's a very simple way. So this is the payoff of individual A, of individual B. And it's just weighted the utility. And you shouldn't, let's say at this stage, necessarily equate utility with some measurable unit. Also in neuroeconomics, we have come to believe that there is a real physiological process going on that's strongly related to what we call utility or subjective value. But for the time being, we don't need that notion. And it's just 1 minus beta plus beta. So beta is the weight on others' payoff. If beta is 0, I'm egoistic. And we have a beta and an alpha. That just means that if I am better off than the other guy, I value his payoff by beta. If I'm worse off than the other guy, I value his payoff by alpha. And we know from lots of studies that this matters, whether people are better off or worse off than the other person. There is a discontinuity, and you will see it in the data basically also that I show you in a minute. There's really a discontinuity between beta and alpha. These are not the same things. And okay, that's everything about the model, so to speak, very simple. And now I show you, so people were here lying in the scanner, basically in a brain scanner. They saw many of these trials, and now I show you the behavioral data. So we estimated the betas and the alphas with some econometric techniques, and that's what we find. What you see here is, this is the beta parameter. This is altruism in the domain of advantage when you have advantageous payoff inequality. And the betas are clearly bigger than the alphas, okay? And what you see here is that we have altruism in both domains, in the advantageous and the disadvantageous domain, but it's much higher in the advantageous domain. It's on average not quite 0.3, but there are large individual differences. So every point here is an individual. And these differences in the alpha and beta parameters translate into enormous differences in willingness to pay to be altruistic. What I mean by this, how much I'm willing to give up in order to increase your payoff by 1 unit. Am I willing to give up just 10 cents for a dollar that you get, or 20 cents, or even $2? Okay, and individuals differ a lot in this regard because there is a nonlinear relationship between the maximum willingness to pay for altruistic acts and the beta parameter. So what you see here at 0.5, that means if I have a beta of 0.5, I'm willing to give up $1 to increase your payoff by $1. If I have a beta of 0.8, I'm willing to give up $4 in order to increase your payoff by $1. Okay, this already tells you that we don't expect many individuals to be here. Okay. And most individuals are somewhere here, okay? And 0.3 means on average they're here. Okay, so now then the next question is, we see these altruistic choices. How does the human brain generate these choices? Now, as an economist, and also the evidence shows that clearly, I believe, from neuroeconomic studies, altruistic choice is not fundamentally different from any other choice where you have a cost and a benefit, okay? You have to weigh costs and benefits. The benefits come here in the form of altruism, okay? They come here in the form of you derive, let's say, subjective value from providing some resource to some other individual. And what you see here is, what we expect, therefore, here is that an area in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, so, or sometimes you say the medial orbitofrontal cortex, that's the area where most people now believe that subjective value is encoded. And it has been shown that subjective value, in the sense of the overall option, is also, for altruistic choices, is also encoded in that area. And that's a beautiful paper by this set of authors published in the Journal of Neuroscience, who show that all these voxels correlate with, so to speak, the subjective value that is associated with altruistic choices. And what's interesting is that there's an overlap between these voxels and voxels that are activated when people buy ordinary goods, a Bounty, a Mars, chocolate, whatever. Okay, so subjective value encoded in ventromedial prefrontal cortex takes place for any goal-directed choice, basically, be it altruistic, whether it has whether it requires a complex social evaluation or a simple evaluation like, let's say, a Bounty or so. And I won't say much about this. We have 2 hours, I was told, or at least I hope you stay that long. But we have enough time to discuss things at the end. So I have, of course, many more studies that tell us something about these things. But I like to go into depth with regard to 2 studies. And for example, one thing, we have one study where we tried the one hot area is now, is it possible to make people more altruistic, more pro-social? And what does that do to the brain? And I can tell you a little bit about that afterwards. So now, why do we expect a temporoparietal junction to be involved in altruistic decision-making? Well, that area has been reliably activated in theory of mind tasks. So when you have to mentalize, to think about others' belief, to think about others' goals and motives, then you mentalize, and then this area is reliably activated. And it has also been shown that preschoolers with better theory of mind abilities, they behave more altruistically. There's one paper from developmental psychology on this. Rebecca Sachs, by the way, from MIT, has done a lot of research on the TPJ and has many interesting papers on this topic. And there's a more recent paper that shows that this area seems to be involved in overcoming egocentricity bias in social judgments. So it's a paper by Zilani et al. In the Journal of Neuroscience 2013, and they have a paradigm where they measure egocentricity bias, and what they do is they downregulate this area and can show that egocentricity bias increases. So this area seems to be involved in overcoming egocentricity bias, and that isn't that directly, it smells like it plays a role in altruistic decision-making, okay? Because in altruistic decision-making, you also have to overcome, so to speak, you have to be willing to bear the cost, okay? And there may be a selfish force, there's a weight in you or a goal in you that tells you maybe go for the selfish option, and you have to overcome that drive. And so it could be that TPJ is therefore also in altruistic decision-making playing an important role. And then there is a nice study by again, a set of this Caltech group from Antonio Rangelis and Todd Fehr, who is now in Zurich. And they show that TPJ is this correlative data, this is not causal data, but they show that people with higher TPJ activation, they respond more strongly to increases in the deservingness of a charity. So this is a task where people could spend money on charities. And of course, some people in this room, I guess we are in Massachusetts, not many of you would spend money on the National Rifle Association, perhaps, but some of you might spend money on an organization that helps the poor, okay? So people differ in their assessment of the deservingness of charities, and obviously that deservingness plays a role for how much they give. and the TPJ seems to play a role, at least in terms of correlative brain activation, is involved somehow in that decision. So this is why so this leads to the following conjecture. We conjectured based on previous evidence that brain structure as well as brain activity in TPJ may play a role in human altruism, okay? And so what we did is we measured gray matter volume in TPJ in our subjects. These are all the same subjects that about with whom I'm talking right now, these 35 people who were in our brain scanner, and we measured their functional brain activation during the altruism task. Now the question is, does gray matter volume in TPJ predict the individual differences? We saw these huge individual differences. And it would be intriguing, you see, could it be the case that those who have more cells here, more gray matter, that they could be more altruistic? I mean, in a sense, like those who have trained to be piano players, they have enlarged finger areas in the brain, something like that, but here applied to a very different cognitive operation. Well, in fact, that's what we find. So we find that people with more gray matter volume in the TPJ, they display higher degrees of altruism. So this is TPJ volume. This is gray matter volume in TPJ. And this is the beta parameter, so altruism in the domain of advantageous inequality. By the way, we find nothing for the domain of disadvantageous inequality, which I believe is a very different animal, cognitively, behaviorally. And I have just had a meeting with Felix Warneken. You find there's more and more evidence accumulating that altruism in the domain of advantageous versus altruism in the domain of disadvantageous inequality. There's something additional playing a role when you are behind. And there's not the same situation, okay? So I concentrate on altruism in the domain of when you're better off, okay? And we see this nice correlation here. Now the question is, why do we observe this? Does this give us some way to understand the brain better? Well, we were hypothesizing as follows. Well, there's this paper by Silani that I already mentioned, and they show basically that TPJ is important for overcoming egocentricity bias. Now, in altruistic decision-making, that translates into TPJ is important for overcoming egoism, for bearing the costs of the altruistic choice. And this implies the following hypothesis for TPJ activation during the altruistic choice. And here is the hypothesis. So if, let's say, you have a certain degree of altruism, let's say a certain beta value, a certain willingness to pay. Now consider the following three situations. One situation is, here is your willingness to pay, and the cost of the altruistic act is low, let's say. That's kind of a no-brainer. You don't need much to overcome. So here you wouldn't say you need TPJ to overcome your egocentricity bias, because it's clear the cost is so low relative to what you're willing to pay. Now think of the other situation. The cost is far above your willingness to pay. It's clear, here you do the selfish choice. There's nothing that could make you overcome such a high cost. So the hypothesis is, well, if the cost is really close to your willingness to pay, so you're willing to pay 50 cents to increase the other person's payoff by $1. Now your cost is 49, let's say. That's, we thought, where TPJ is playing a role, overcoming, where this notion of overcoming plays a role. And so we did the following analysis. We looked at this in this paper, and here are the activations for TPJ. And this is TPJ activation when the cost is higher than the willingness to pay, when it's 2 levels lower than the willingness to pay, when it's just below the willingness to pay. And you get this inverted U-shaped pattern. So kind of this brain area functionally, in functional activity, peaks right when it's kind of really needed, so to speak, to go over the threshold. And so that's the story we are telling here, and that's our interpretation that we give to this data set. And I should say this was not an ex post hypothesis. This was an ex ante hypothesis. We really struggling, what does the brain activation tell us? And after we read this paper, this hypothesis really was neatly falling, so to speak, into our hands. Okay, so this is what we find here, but so let me summarize then here. What we find is relative gray matter volume predicts individual differences in human altruism. And there's a thrilling hypothesis behind this. Could it, I mean, nobody has proven this hypothesis, but could it be the case that through appropriate training, appropriate socialization, you can turn people into more pro-social individuals? And actually, there is nice evidence. There's some unpublished work that indicates that this is possible. And could that be associated with long-run changes in brain structure in the same way that that when learning to play piano is associated with changes in brain structure? Actually, I believe that this is true, but it's just wild speculation at this point in time. But it would be thrilling if somebody could find that out. So we have, for each individual in this data set, a measured maximum willingness to pay. Based on what we know about TPJ from previous work, we predict an inverted U-shaped functional activation pattern. And the functional activation pattern is confirmed by fMRI data. And what's nice here is that we go from brain structure, which is very rare, to brain. You see, there is a link suddenly. There's a link. I mean, typically, it's very difficult to make a link from brain structure to brain activation. But here, the theory helps us, or the way of measuring maximum willingness to pay, because we see that gray matter volume affects maximum willingness to pay for altruistic acts, which is the beta, basically. And that, again, helps us to find out about the peak of functional activation in TPJ during altruistic choice. Okay, so now the next step then is it really causal? I mean, almost all neuroimaging work doesn't get at causality. I mean, we get at causality, of course, in the sense that if I implement a particular task, I can infer that this task is causal for the activation. So I induce a mentalizing task. Well, mentalizing task activates a particular brain area. In this way, I have causality. But I don't have causality typically in the sense that, is this just an epiphenomenon? Is this really necessary for the task? Or is it just a correlation? And so it's an important question to ask whether we can find causal evidence for the role of TPJ. And that's what we did in this next study, which is not yet, well, just about to be submitted. So we see what will come out then in terms of publication. So what did we do? Well, we applied non-invasive brain stimulation to the right TPJ. So this is basically transcranial magnetic stimulation. We used a particular protocol. We used what's called continuous theta burst TMS. And that's a very nice method because you only apply it for 40 seconds. You see, it's very short, and you have it has an effect. It creates an after effect close to 1 hour. And so it's beautiful. You have this 1 hour window where you can run an experiment, and you have basically subjects with downregulated TPJ here. And we stimulate the right TPJ. We have the vertex, so to speak, the middle here as the control condition. And we know that this stimulation protocol inhibits neural activity of this brain area for about 60 minutes. Okay? So now here's the task. So what we did is the following. So Chao Hui, my graduate student, collected 70 charities. And we have a one-paragraph description of what these charities do. And this one-paragraph description is then further boiled down to a one-sentence description. For example, in the scanner, they see the fixation cross. Then for 1 second, they see that they can now donate money to Caritas Switzerland. And what's the mission of that charity? Help the poor. Okay? And then they are asked how much to donate. And as soon as they have inserted a number, they have made a decision, and they move to the next trial. Now, at the end, one of these 70 trials is randomly chosen for payment, and the money that they get in total 100 points, which is worth 50 francs, and the money indeed goes to the charity they decided. So there's no deception involved. Okay, so this is the setup in the scanner, and here you see the timeline of the experiment. So all subjects read this one paragraph description and then the mission of the charity. And at that stage, they rated the charity in terms of several items. And what's most important is they rated the charity in terms of deservingness. But also how well they know it, whether they are close means, do they in some way benefit from that charity? Do they have a sister or a brother who works for them or who received in the past a benefit from that charity, and so on. And also they rate it in terms of how old is the charity. Then we measure their mood, calmness, and alertness in order to see whether TMS has an impact on these variables. Then we do the theta burst TMS, and then immediately the donation task starts for 10 minutes. Then they do again the post-TMS evaluation of all this here. Because we want to know whether we affected, that's a very critical question in the end is, what does TMS really do here? For example, one hypothesis could be that, well, judging deservingness is like mentalizing. So maybe TMS encodes this deservingness information, and by disrupting this brain area, they're no longer able to basically rate deservingness properly. Or there are many, I show you different hypotheses about this later on. So we wanted to know whether the theta burst TMS disrupts basically their ability to make judgments about the charities. And then we do again the mood, calmness, and alertness questionnaire. Okay, so let me come to the hypothesis. So one hypothesis could be that RTPJ, so the right TPJ activity, encodes deservingness information. Now, therefore, a reduction in RTPJ activity reduces deservingness. Okay? Now, if for any, let's say and that could translate into a reduction of donations. Okay, what form graphically that would look like as follows. Here you see the undistorted deservingness judgments before the TMS. Here you have the potentially distorted deservingness judgments after the TMS. And in the vertex condition, which is our placebo condition, there's no distortion, whereas in the TPJ condition, we find this reduction in deservingness. Okay? And that reduction in deservingness could translate into a reduction in donations. Now you're just as a function of undistorted pre-deservingness judgments. So that's one hypothesis, the deservingness reduction hypothesis. Another hypothesis could be that you make the individuals totally unable to make any reasonable judgments and they give random responses, deservingness responses, which translate into random donation decisions, and then you would just see the red line would just be flat here, okay? When it's just random at some level. That would be an additional hypothesis. And then there is a third hypothesis, which is, it could be that deservingness judgments remain intact, and that only the willingness to donate is reduced. Okay, that's also possible. So that would mean that the vertex, the placebo group, and the TPJ group, they have undistorted exposed deservingness judgments, but you have still a change in donations because it reduces willingness to pay for the charity, in line with, let's say, the previous evidence that the TPJ is necessary to overcome egocentricity bias. Now note that this hypothesis at the behavioral level and the previous hypothesis is undistinguishable. If you would only have behavioral data, we could not decide, is it the deservingness that's distorted, that's driving it, or is it something else? Now, that's the reason why we need these deservingness judgments, because that helps us to distinguish between the true mechanism, so to speak, that underlies the potential TMS effects. Now, here I show you the results next. Well, what do we find? Well, this is deservingness before TMS, this is deservingness after TMS, no effect. So kind of, if you come from a mentalizing perspective and you read the whole literature on mentalizing, this is kind of a surprise. Because after all, making a judgment about whether that charity is deserving, that is mentalizing. You have to think of what is this charity doing? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And what turns out to be the case is that no distortion in the judgments, but a big distortion in the behavior. So basically the slope between deservingness and donations becomes much flatter. Okay? It's not surprising that we don't find much here. Why? Well, if you don't want to give to a charity that you think is undeserving, then TMS can't do much, but here we find a big effect. This is a sizable effect because here people give on average 45 and in the placebo group, and they give only 30. It's one-third reduction of the willingness to behave altruistically. So, okay, having shown this, there's a recent literature that suggests that TPJ plays an important role in social decision-making. Not just, so it involves somehow other people. So there's a paper by Scott Huettel in Transit Cognitive Sciences who makes that point. And given that literature, we thought, well, we have two types of charities. We have charities who help the dolphins, and we have charities who help the people. So let's look at the social charities who help the people versus the non-social charities who help to keep the Atlantic Ocean clean or whatever, yeah? So some environmental goals or some animal rights goals and so on. And what we find here is quite interesting because the TMS effect is particularly pronounced for those charities that help the people, and not so much for the charities that help the animals or the environment, which suggests that it's really about altruism towards other people, which lends, so to speak, specificity, in a sense, interesting social specificity to the role of the role of TPJ here. Now, you have, of course, to ask yourself, we have this behavioral effect. Now a critical reviewer comes and says, well, but maybe you just you changed their mood or whatever you did. And so you have to control for all these other things. And maybe they have now different familiarity. They view all these, they think they are now closer or further away from the charities. You distort their judgments in a way. We have already seen that we don't distort deservingness judgments, but maybe the other judgments. So let's look at this. And what we do here, we computed correlations between pre-TMS judgment and post-TMS judgment. And we compare this correlation across treatment groups, Vertex versus TPJ. And that's what you see here. So this is deservingness, this is closeness, familiarity, and age. And what you see here is the TPJ and the Vertex. So these are standard errors. And it's hugely overlapping here. So what you see here is there's just nothing significant. The correlation between pre and post across all these judgments is the same. Okay, now you might say, well, correlations, maybe that's weak evidence. Let's look at the levels post. Do we have exposed different levels? And what you see here is, again, the levels that are, this is again Vertex versus TPJ. There's just nothing here. So we are pretty sure that it's not some other effect, some other indirect effect. We also looked at mood, alertness, calmness, no effect. Okay, so basically, that brings me already to my conclusions. There's a large literature on the evolutionary foundations of human altruism and on specific motives underlying altruistic behaviors. Rather little is known about the proximate biological mechanisms. Here we have shown that brain structure and brain activity in TPJ seems to play a crucial role in altruistic decision-making. We are able to generate a link from brain anatomy, brain structure, to brain activation via this method, I really want to sell this also to the psychologists because we have here a method of estimating individuals' utility function that gives us the maximum willingness to pay, which exactly enables us to make that link. It's very important. Without this ability, we would not have been able to make that link between anatomy and functional activation. And it suggests that the hypothesis that RTPJ activation is important for overcoming self-interested behaviors. And we have shown that non-invasive downregulation of RTPJ, well, that's the hypothesis that follows out of this. And we have shown that it's true. And the upshot of all this is RTPJ is not necessary for performing the theory of mind operations involved in altruistic behaviors. But it's crucial for the transformation of these judgments into altruistic choices, particularly in the case of charities that help people. And so it suggests that this brain area is involved in modulating the weight that is given to other people. And in this sense, it's crucial. It's basically making people more or less altruistic because it's involved in weighing other people's welfare or payoff in the decision-making process. And how could that be important for other areas? Well, I have found a very nice application case which is related to autism spectrum disorder. So we know that subjects with autism spectrum disorder, they show a deficit in mentalizing tasks. They also show reduced TPJ activation in mentalizing tasks, and they have decreased gray matter volume in TPJ. So what would we predict? Well, we would predict that subjects with ASD display a lower willingness to donate, which should be particularly pronounced for charities that help people. That's the prediction that follows, given our results. And that's exactly what we observe in this paper. So there seems to be, so that is the way where we might be able to make a link between some psychiatric diseases and this altruism research, which was not obvious from the beginning. Thank you very much for your attention. So now it's Josh's task to criticize me. Okay, I sit down here.
Well, first, thank you so much for giving me the chance to comment on Ernst Fehr's talk. It's a great honor. For as long as I've been in this business, Ernst Fehr has been a leading light, and I've admired his work for a very long time. And so it's wonderful to have this opportunity. And I love the work that he's presented. And actually, there's really no criticism coming. Just some thoughts about possible hypotheses and future directions. So I want to do a couple things. First, I want to. Sorry?
If you have too many arguments, I forgot it.
Oh, good. Thought he was coming up to defend himself before I even got started. So first, I want to explore a little bit more of this idea of this connection between theory of mind, perhaps perspective taking, and altruism. And then I want to talk about a study that just came out by Abigail Marsh and colleagues. There's an advanced copy of it up on the web now in PNAS, looking at extreme altruists and their neural and cognitive characteristics. And then say a few words about how putting those two things together suggests some other directions that one might take, building on this research and other research. So first, just an observation that this is, I think, is a very nice example of the much maligned reverse inference. So if you follow research in functional neuroimaging, there's been this trend where you say you can't learn anything about psychology from the brain. And I think that doesn't make a lot of sense. But nevertheless, because there's been a lot of overreach and overinterpreting of brain-based results to draw psychological conclusions, I think the field had swung too far in the other direction. And I think that this is a really nice example of how you're not just learning, okay, well, it has to be somewhere in the brain, and I guess that's its address. That understanding that a brain region that's well characterized for its involvement in representing the mental states of other people is playing a critical role in altruism, which is not obviously true, and I'll say more about that. That tells you something about the psychology. Now, I don't think that nails down any one interpretation conclusively, but I think the amount of psychological level information conveyed by these results is not zero, and that I think is a modest claim. But I think it's an important thing for us to keep in mind. Those of us who are in this business of trying to understand the mind in biological terms. Okay, so what is the relationship between theory of mind, or sorry, I should say, the temporal parietal junction and the operations it performs, and altruism? So Ernst talked about overcoming egocentric bias. In the paper I got in advance, the term he tended to use was perspective taking. I assume that's not a change of mind, but just two different ways of talking about it. So why are those two things related? Well, you can see how taking another person's perspective could make you more altruistic, but it certainly doesn't have to be that way. That is, having a good theory of mind and ability to understand the intentions and values and behavioral dispositions of other people, that can be a kind of Machiavellian intelligence. It can allow you to outsmart other people for your own advantage. A nice study exemplifying this done by here, some years ago, by Nick Epley, Eugene Caruso, and Max Bazerman, put people in a kind of competitive context. It was actually a very clever design. They had people engaged in a cookie baking contest, and in some cases, they were told, think about the other people, the people who are your competitors. And other cases, they were just allowed to go about their business. And in that case, when they were explicitly instructed to take the perspective of the other people, they took more of the high-quality Godiva chocolate chips and less of the lousy CVS chocolate chips, and left those for the people on the other team. So it makes sense, and it has been amply demonstrated that thinking about putting yourself in someone else's shoes can make you more altruistic, or it can make you better able to outcompete them. So there's no necessary logical connection between theory of mind, perspective taking, and altruism. And yet, here it is. So then this raises the question, why is that the case? And in interpreting the functional data, I think Ernst gives a very nice explanation, in particular that when, and in a sense, it would make sense for almost any account, but when people are on the fence, whatever it is that's doing the job of making you a little more altruistic, that's going to be when you're going to see the most activity. But the results with the structural data, that is increased gray matter for more altruism, that's hard to explain. It's consistent with that, but that doesn't provide an explanation for that. So taking at least the gray matter volume results, why do people with these nice big Cadillac RTPJs end up being more altruistic? So I want to put forth two hypotheses. Maybe they're both right, maybe they're both wrong. I don't think these are the only ones on the table. So one of them is inspired by Peter Singer's argument or line of reasoning in his book, The Expanding Circle, in which he says, at some point, you look around, and that humans are becoming more and more altruistic over time, and while that seems surprising, our colleague Steven Pinker has documented that at least certain ways this seems to be true, especially when it comes to being nonviolent, but other ways as well. And Singer's idea is that when you make the connection, when you say, those people on the other side of the hill, they're actually really just like me. They have my hopes and my dreams and my pains when they suffer just like I do. Why should I not care about them? And so you can call this the kind of cognitive leap hypothesis, that the ability to put yourself in the other person's position, to see that they are like you, if that is indeed true, kind of automatically causes you then to value their outcomes, if not as much as your own, then at least more than you otherwise would. Now, that's an empirical hypothesis in the sense that it may be true, that when you have that capacity to put yourself in the other person's shoes, you do tend to make that leap. It's not a logically necessary leap, but it may be something that happens. And so it could be that the relationship between the big theory of mind region and more altruism is just the people who are better at getting themselves in the minds of other people end up being more altruistic. For that reason, they're more likely to make that cognitive leap. Another possibility is that there's a kind of coevolution between altruism and theory of mind that may occur over genetic time periods, or perhaps occurs culturally or within one's own individual experience. And the story would go something like this. At least in some environments, there are great gains to be made by cooperating. And cooperation requires at least some kind of upfront altruism, a willingness to pay a cost that is not necessarily at that moment at least, or even down the road going to bring you a benefit. But that requires two things. First, you have to have some willingness to help others, at least in the short term when there's no immediate payoff, and you have to have some sense of when this is likely to work or not. If you're just indiscriminately sacrificing for other other people, that's not going to go very well. And so it could be that the people who end up developing their theory of mind skills are also people who at the same time have developed their altruism skills, because that's the magic combination for benefiting yourself in an environment that affords benefits to cooperation. Now, if that's the right story, then this is interesting, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is it may provide an explanation about the animals' data. That is, if contrast this with the cognitive leap hypothesis. If it's about cognitive leaps, well, why not leap into animal brains as well, an animal experience as well into that of other humans? Whereas if it's about a buildup of skills that enable one to exploit the benefits of cooperation, we cooperate with other people, not so much with the dolphins, and so that may explain why you see that asymmetry there. Another test of this hypothesis would be to look in different cultures. So Zurich's a lovely place, and and we know from cross-cultural data that this is a place where people are in laboratory economic games, quite altruistic compared to other places. And so we find there when you zap people's TPJs, they become less altruistic. But if you zap Tony Soprano's RTPJ, he might go soft, right? That is, you might be destroying his Machiavellian intelligence. So if it's dependent on exploiting the advantages of your particular environment, then you might see more cross-cultural variation or specific kinds of cross-cultural variation in these effects. So that's one possible direction. So I'll just leave those two hypotheses on the table, and I'll come back to at least one of them in a moment. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about Abigail Marsh et al.'s new paper. It's a really interesting paper. It's about extreme altruists, and in this case that means people who donated their kidneys to strangers. And they had a very specific hypothesis, which somewhat ironically was inspired by the literature on psychopathy. So it's been found that psychopaths have relatively small amygdalas, and they're relatively bad specifically at fear recognition. You show them faces of people who are afraid, and they don't know what that is. One of them in her earlier study said, I don't know what that face is, but that's what people do when I'm about to kill them. They don't know what. This is someone who was behind bars at the time. And so they said, well, maybe it doesn't have to be, but maybe extreme altruists are like the mirror images of the psychopaths. And so they went to great lengths, and they found 19 people who had donated their kidneys to strangers who were willing to come into the lab, and they had them do the fear recognition and other emotional recognition tasks. And lo and behold, those people were better on average at fear recognition. You saw more activity in their amygdalas when they were responding to fearful faces, and similar to Ernst's results, they had larger amygdalas. So this is another case. So one interesting parallel. So this is yet another case where there seems to be an enlargement of a structure that's involved in some kind of altruistic behavior. The other thing that's interesting is that that there's a connection, a non-obvious connection between social cognition that is not necessarily inherently good or bad. There's nothing inherently good or bad about being able to recognize fearful faces. Again, in a Machiavellian way, you could use that to your advantage. Oh, Ernst is scared. Now I can really, get the knife in, right? But and in the same way, theory of mind doesn't necessarily have to lead to altruistic behavior. And finally, the third parallel is that I think both of these studies highlight an unknown missing ingredient. And this is, I think, a case where opportunity for future direction. So in Marsh's data, they find that the extreme altruists do have, on average, bigger amygdalas, more reactive amygdalas to fear faces. They're a little bit better, on average, at recognizing fear faces. But they're not categorically different. It's just that the distributions are shifted a little bit. And donating kidneys is extremly rare. Some of you in this room probably have pretty big amygdalas. How many of you have donated your kidneys to strangers? One? Not even one? Okay. So the big question is, well, what is it that takes someone who's got a nice ripe amygdala for this kind of extreme altruism and then turns them into somebody who actually goes ahead and does it? Now, in talking to Marsh and reading up on other people who've donated, they end up being quite philosophical. And in fact, they sound like, and this is coming full circle, like Peter Singer. So one of the people who was interviewed as one of these kidney donors, she said the way she ended up doing this was, at first she was going to donate her kidney to her very good friend's mother or close relative who needed it. And then it turned out she wasn't a match. And then she thought, well, if I'm willing to do it for her, why not for just some stranger? It does just as much good, right? Why should I not allow that more distant person to be just as much a part of my circle, right? And it seems like there's a kind of philosophical thinking that takes that empathetic response and then allows it to be extended to somebody else. And I think the connection here, or a possible connection with what Ernst described, is with those alphas, which you didn't talk much about. You mentioned a little bit. That is, there was the TPJ volume and reactivity correlates with giving when you're in the advantageous situation. I'm doing well, you're not doing so well, here, have a little bit. And this is a kind of garden variety generosity. Not everybody does it, but it's fairly familiar. I'm feeling generous, I'm doing well, you're not doing so well. The exceptional people are those few people who said, you know what, you've got it better than I do right now, at least in this task, but, and I assume that there was a gain in expanding the pie and the net utility in the cases where people did this, maybe that's not the case. They said, look, even if you're doing better than me, if I can make a small sacrifice so that you can have things even better with an even larger increment, then I'll go ahead and do that. And again, that's a kind of utilitarian thought, which is to say, even though it's kind of unfair, even though I'm a little bit miffed that I'm the one who's getting the short end of the stick here, if I can enlarge the pie, if I can make a small sacrifice in order to make things much better for somebody else, well, I'll go ahead and do that. And I think in a way that's like the altruistic kidney donors. Not that they're necessarily worse off than the people that they're giving to, but they're going far above and beyond what you would expect from a gut level, everyday kind of empathetic generosity. And so what I would be curious to know is what's going on with those people? That is, in Marsh's study, what is it that makes you go from having a big amygdala, which might push you in that direction, to being one of those rare people who actually is willing to donate a kidney? And in your case, I'd like to know, what is it beyond having maybe a somewhat bigger TPJ, if they do, that makes people willing to enlarge the pie and help somebody else even when they're already receiving the short end of the stick? Now, my guess is that this has something to do, again, with a kind of reflective philosophical thinking. That is, someone saying, why it's not going to be based on a sort of immediate gut reaction, but rather an assessment of the larger, greater good. And I think this just to bring this to a close, my primary interest, and I think perhaps Ernst as well, is not in people's everyday interactions, although that's interesting as well, but how can we use these tools, how can we use our understanding to have better policies, to make the world better on a sort of a larger scale. And my guess is that these basic mechanisms of empathy, where we see variation in the TPJ and we see in the amygdala, those are necessary platforms. If we didn't have those basic social instincts, we wouldn't be able to make any improvements. But a lot of the gain is going to actually come from inculcating certain kinds of philosophical ideas that you may not necessarily see in an enlarged amygdala or an enlarged RTPJ. So I'll leave it at that, and thanks very much.
Particular to say here, except that I found it very interesting what you just told us. Maybe one interesting set of data. So there is, I mean, Felix, you should also know that. Maybe you know it better than I know. But there are some data that show when you look at kids. So we ran experiments with kids where they could go for one unit for themselves and 1 unit for the other partner, so it's an egalitarian distribution, or 1 for themselves and 2 for the other partner. And when you look at that, how that evolves from age 3 onward, they go more and more to the egalitarian solution. So they don't give the other kids the other unit. So up to age 8, so that's what we observe. And there are funny stories. They rationalize that in a funny way. For example, one child told us afterwards, well, we gave them sweets to eat afterwards, and they said, you know, the other child will get bad teeth when or one child had the following strategy. She played any, many, moo. You know, she seemed to randomize the choice. And then we told her, you shouldn't randomize. You should choose what you want. And she said, oh, I already know where I want to end up. So she also chose 1 over 1, 2. So these were the clever rationalizations of the kids. But when you go beyond age 8, then that reverses. And you go to age 12, 13, 18, then more and more. So at age 8, 80% of the kids, at least in our sample, they didn't want to give they didn't want to maximize the pie. They went for fairness, equality. But later on, there's a reversal, so that when they are 18 years old or so, most of them go to, or many of them are willing to give the other person this other unit. And well, you may know better what that involves developmentally, but in the end, it's also, of course, a question of the parameters, you see. If I can increase the pie by 1 million by paying $1, who wouldn't do that? You need to be pretty antisocial almost to not to do that. But if I am in this interpersonal context where, let's say, where the gains are not that high, then fairness and equality still plays a big role. But how that, the questions you raised are fascinating questions. I can't answer them. So maybe there are some other people in the room.
Does this work? I have many questions.
Great.
Hopefully, we'll talk about it over dinner. But so from the brain point of view, and I know that you only have a certain amount of time to talk about your work here so far. We don't think any longer about a small area of the brain doing stuff, but actually being part of a larger network.
Yeah.
Now, if we go back enough, say Derek Denny Brown in the 1950s, there's always been this sort of, there are lots of dichotomies in neurology between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, where lesions in the frontal lobe tend to produce grasp, attachment, whereas lesions in the parietal lobe tend to produce avoidance things, which sort of goes with what you say. The parietal lobe is the social lobe. But it seems to me that it has to be another part of the brain that is giving you the other valence. All you've shown us is that if the TPJ is more active, you give more. If you go less active, you give less. You haven't told us where is the region where you don't give anything. In fact, you go after the other guy. See? So what we're looking for, what I'm looking for is where's the other side? For instance, could the same region in the left hemisphere
You mean the left TPJ? Or
the right TPJ. Would the left TPJ be interested in saying, I'm going to donate or I'm not going to donate? If you decide to donate, then the right hemisphere perhaps decides how much to donate if the frontal lobe is in agreement with it. It's not actually pushing its own. I'm trying to sort of expand the view of the brain participating in this decision from this little area to a much larger.
No, I'm very glad that you raised that question. I mean, we of course, we don't believe that this brain area is doing this in isolation. So basically, I just wrote up that paper. And I have a lot of temptation to speculate how other brain areas are involved. But I also know that the referees kill me for that. And so I stayed as close to the data as I could. And I think if I'm saying TPJ is involved in the transformation of deservingness judgments into behavior, into altruistic choices, then that's very close to what the data are. Now, you can ask me what I believe, what's involved, and I tell you what I believe, what's involved. I believe that TPJ is involved in weighing the other person's welfare here. And that occurs through information transmission to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And so the subjective value area. Because the nice thing about having that hypothesis, that maintained hypothesis, which is corroborated by a lot of data, that this area encodes subjective value, is that every choice, every goal-directed choice, the information has to go through that area. That's really a disciplining hypothesis because it gives you a lot of other hypotheses you can test. Maybe it will turn out to be wrong that it's only that only area. But I think as a maintained hypothesis, it will be very productive. Now, I told you about another data set. So where we have an experiment where we have randomly assigned subjects to 2 conditions. And one condition was they were every week called up and asked to make a decision about giving money to somebody else. They could determine who that somebody else is. It could be their wife, their child, their friend, a stranger, but they had to do that, spending money on others for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, I think, or 8 weeks, once a week. And in the other condition, they spend money on themselves, okay? Training, so to speak, spending money on others, spending money on self. And then we brought the people into the lab, into this kind of altruism task then. And not surprisingly, one group behaved much more selfishly than the other group. Now, the interesting thing is what happens in the brain. And what happens in the brain is really beautiful. Because what we find is that in those people who have been trained to spend money on others, or to think about spending money on others, we get different connectivity between TPJ and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And that's exactly the kind of message I think you were after. So what are the other, after all, it's a network. And what is the network involved? So we are really keen to identify that network. And that's what we find. So this is one preliminary result we find. You have a question.
Your work raises a very interesting, more general possibility that the temporal junction has something to do with integrating intellectual processing and emotional processing. Because I can see responses to some of these behavioral paradigms as being driven by a lot of emotions, guilt, fear, duty, obligation, pleasure, altruism is a very complicated emotion. But I started to think in that way, that this may be a hub in a kind of an integrative network that puts all the intellectual and emotional data together. So when you turn it off, you may dull that integrative process.
Yeah, but would that already imply, for example, lower donations? If that, I'm not so sure. Yeah. So you see, basically what it does, you could reframe the result we see is people respond less to increases in deservingness when this region is turned off. So sometimes these increases in deservingness don't translate into increases in donations as they did before. So some of this deservingness information is lost in the brain somehow. And my preferred interpretation, it's not no longer transmitted to the subjective value area. That is my hypothesis, again, causal for making the ultimate choice then.
Yeah, but maybe somewhere in terms of either the intellectual processing, emotional processing, or the action that takes place is blunted by interfering with the function of that part of the brain.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thought, yeah. So there are now many people. So I think you were first, then you, and then in the back. Sorry. So 1, 2, 3.
So I have a question about whether or not mental illness group is actually a process that's being targeted by the CMS. So it makes a lot of sense that you recruit TPJ when we're dealing with one other person with whom we're playing the game. But the identifiable victim effect literature would suggest that we think really differently about abstract charities than we do the individual recipients of our donations. So maybe one possibility is that with the TPJ manipulation is going to change how much you're thinking about the experimenter thinks about our donation. And so then the question becomes, well, why the more donations or the decrease in social versus non-social? So what I wanted to know was whether or not people in the Vertex Commission were donating more in general to the social charities than the non-social charities, because then you would have a greater opportunity to move down from that.
No, they did the same. They did the same. So that was not the difference. Yeah. You have a question?
So, yeah, a couple more maybe technical questions. Across these, Hi. Across the different studies, how are you defining the TPJ?
We were in the first study with the gray matter volume. That was a whole brain corrected analysis. Okay. So it just popped up. And then what we did when we computed, so that gives us the correlation. Then in the other picture we have shown you but then we defined the region anatomically. Also, let me show you the picture.
I mean, at some point, right, you have to draw a line around something in the brain and say this is TPJ and everything outside of it is not.
Yeah,
And I'm
so
wondering
what we did, this was this whole brain corrected. That popped up, okay.
But what are those yellow, right? So you're saying in that particular subject, all the yellow is TPJ?
Well, so you want to know what if I look at all the studies we have done there, then this is the area that has been typically called TPJ. So when you look, for example, here we took an ROI, here we selected the ROI independently. And
using what?
We used, I think we used, Morish, this guy did it. We used an anatomical definition.
But I mean, there's no, it's not like V1, V2, where you could look at the histology and say, this is V1 on the left and this is V2 on the right. I mean, there's nothing anatomically that defines that.
That defines this area. Well, then
I mean, in other words, you must have used something functional, no, to say this is TPJ.
To be honest, I would have to ask this guy who did it.
I was just worried about some circularity in the thing that you're drawing there, because
in which way? In
other words, your final summative slide that shows you have this beautiful link with the theory in the middle, right? The willingness to pay, and then the volume on the left, and then this task or either the inhibition or the inverted U function on the right.
Yes.
But depending on how you define TPJ, it seems like there's some risk of circularity there. And I was just trying to figure out whether there is a risk or there isn't. And
let me resort to this. I think we have no risk when Joske does it, but I would have to ask him in detail.
One other semi-technical question, which is, you mentioned that there was a bigger effect for, this is with the TMS study, I think, for social versus non-social. Yeah. But if there was, you also showed that, right, you see the biggest effect, obviously, for the highest deserving thing. Yes. So if there was a big difference in the deservingness of people-based charities versus non-people-based charities, you might see that artifactually.
Yeah, but that was not the case.
It wasn't. Okay.
The distribution is roughly the same.
They were, okay.
Yeah, that's not the case.
I'm guessing that what your colleague did, just to clarify to everyone else in the room, the standard procedure would be to use someone else's fMRI study, which is a whole brain scan, and then that study identifies using some threshold contiguity coupled with some alpha threshold to identify a region, and then to take the voxels from that other study that someone else did and use that to define the ROI.
Yes,
that would be
I'm sure.
Based on what measure?
It's probably based on like the Rebecca Sachs subtraction from false belief and false photograph tests.
Well, I think what we did is we took the Silani data, where they had also an fMRI combined with TMS, the story with the egocentricity bias data. And we used that data and just drew a circle around that data and use that as our ROI. That's my belief, but I would have to look it up.
I think there's problems in making measurements of brain matter. Never mind that the gray matter isn't just neurons either. There's most of the gray matter is not neurons, right? But if you're doing it on something functional and your functional measure, right, is blood flow
threshold at some point.
At some point, there's a thresholding problem where, or you know, an iceberg effect where if someone just has a slightly shifted up or shifted down, you're going to call that a smaller versus a larger area. And so I just find it technically problematic to make that measurement and then associate it with other things, or at least for the way I think about the brain. That's just...
Well, if I mean, going back to your point, if the activations we find here has a big overlap with the gray matter volume we had previously, then I don't think it's a problem. If this region of interest is defined independently from previous studies. So that is not a problem then.
Yeah, that I guess is the...
And then we have no circularity.
But you have to define it functionally somehow, and if...
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. I have to define it functionally. So I believe we took the Silani coordinates and drew a circle around it, and this gave us, so to speak, this blob for the functional analysis. And when I look at the gray matter volume data, then we get a big overlap with many studies. So I'm pretty sure that what I could do here is I take Rebecca Sachs's TPJ mentalizing data, I take 20 studies, and you would see a dot here, you would see one here, one here, one here. You would find a lot of activation here, functional activation. I'm absolutely sure about that. There's no doubt about that. The only doubt is which data did we take to really draw the circle for the functional analysis. So I think the person in the back is the next one. He has waited patiently. Could you say again?
So how do people decide if the costs are known, the benefits are either unknown or fluctuating in an unpredictable way?
Well, I mean, there's a paper by Paul Glimsch's lab where they do, so what we do typically here is the following. We look at behavior, we estimate a subjective value function derived from behavior, and economists would call it a utility function. And then we use the utilities that we get from the utility function to plug it, to use it as a parametric regressor for the bold signal. So basically, I have two options, let's say, two risky options. I have estimated from the behaviors the utility function, so I know the utility of this option, of that option. You chose this. So this was your chosen utility. I take that as a regressor for that trial, and then for every trial. So what it basically means, even when you have uncertainty, people still compute an overall integrated subjective value. So that's the assumption that comes from economics. That's used as a regressor, and what we persistently find is VMP of C. You see so when you take that area, you can have risky options, you can have charitable donations, you can have money, you can have bounties, you can have basically, I mean, this seems to be a general purpose value integration area that codes for what we call decision utility. So the utility of the chosen option at the time of choice. So there was a 1, 2, 3 again, yeah.
I don't know if maybe I missed something, but I'm wondering if there's a reason that we agree with this specific option instead of spite with the same.
You mean spite?
Yeah, with the same. I mean, if it's about how the person is the
Yeah. Well, our behavioral paradigm doesn't allow much spite here. Well, actually, we allowed for spite. Actually, it did allow. So we allowed for situations where people, for example, spite would be if regardless of whether I am ahead or behind, I'm always choosing an option that hurts you. And we just don't observe this behavior in this experiment, which does not mean that it does not exist. So we have data sets that in larger data sets, we reliably find 5 to 10% of the subjects, they are spiteful. So they seem to really decrease the payoff of the other person just for the sake of decreasing it. And interestingly, we found particularly high prevalence of this in India, in this caste society, among the high caste members. So that's, in these dictator games that were our experimental paradigm, you don't usually find much spite. So which doesn't mean it exists. You can, in other contexts, there may be quite a bit of spite, yeah.
But if you were to, manipulate it so that you were kind of baiting them to be spiteful, do you think this is possible?
I think that would be a different process. I think that spite behavior, like retaliatory behavior, spiteful behavior, these are, I have come to believe, so I have a theoretical model that puts them all onto one hat, but I think that aspect of the model is not correct. So I think these are two different animals: spiteful behavior, retaliatory behavior, and kind of generous behavior. They are different. They are really, so I mean, as is inequity aversion, for example, in the domain of advantageous inequality is also very different from inequity aversion in the domain of disadvantageous inequality. If people are behind, kids, other people, they are much more willing to reduce other people's payoff. I mean, it's, and if you look at the egalitarian sentiments that go through the American society these days, I mean, if you would give people the option to reduce some rich billionaire's income by spending money, so for every dollar you spend, somebody loses $100. I think many would do it. Okay, there are two questions. Yeah. Yeah, we looked at it, yeah. So this is an important question. So how stable is it? Is it something that's at that personality level? So what we did is we played these dictator games twice, let's say with a 3-month interval, and we find correlations in estimated beta and alpha parameters of about 0.6. But you get a lot of noise at the individual level. So I think there are many things we don't understand here. And in particular, when the same people, so first of all, we know from neuroeconomics and from many other fields also, choice has a stochastic component. Now, we take that partly out here because the beta parameter is estimated from many choices. So in this sense, the choice randomness is taken out, but there's still a standard error around the beta parameter, okay? And so when you talk about correlations, yeah, that standard error plays a role, how large it is. Now, I think the even bigger problem is across situation stability. And yeah, there are many things we don't understand here. So I just struggle with one data set where we put people in these games, and then we put them in other games. For example, from a dictator game, in a public goods game, in an ultimatum game, in a trust game. And yeah, it is at the individual level, the stability is wanting here to some extent. However, what we do is there are methods now available which are called finite mixture models. So you have Bayesian models that give you a cluster of types, and you get a representative of that cluster, and that is very stable. So, so basically what we find here, we find 3 types typically in these data sets. We call, and the interesting thing is, when you do this exercise, and I like that message a lot, is there are no selfish types out there. So this is because as an economist, because we're so keen on the selfishness assumption have been. But if you literally make the costs really very low, then almost everybody starts giving something. You see? So there's a little bit of altruism in each of us, okay? Even in the very selfish guys. The model doesn't give you the selfish type, you see? The beta equals alpha equals 0 type. So what we have is, if you go into this space here, I think I have to move in this direction. Where is it? Where do I have this diagram? You know this, where I show you the behavioral data? Well, here you have it, basically. Here you see the betas. Now, what I have in mind is the beta-alpha space. Now, there are people who are close to the origin, but not at the origin. Then there are people up there with high alphas, high betas. And then there's a group of 10% spite guys who are negatively inequality averse. So they take away pay. They reduce your payoff if they are behind. These three groups we have, okay? Now, the spiteful types, they are selfish when they are ahead. They're spiteful when they are behind. These guys should never cooperate in a public goods game, but they do. Now, why? I don't know why. Nobody understands why this is the case. So this is really puzzling. So there's a lot of, and this is, by the way, let me say that, I mean, this is one reason why I believe we need to go to a deeper level, to the brain level. There are so many aspects in choices we don't understand. So my hope is the unifying concept comes from going to the brain level. So why do people, when they are hungry, behave more selfishly? Why do people, when they are in a dark room, behave more selfishly? Who knows? I mean, we just observe it, okay? Exactly, that would be so there must be information that comes into the brain that kind of is fed into this network, the network relevant for altruistic behavior, and that could be the unifying concept. You see? So sorry.